This morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of Congress in U.S.-China relations. But first, given the conversation this morning, it seemed that people were particularly interested in the American presidential election. In China, people are extremely interested as well. I got back from a trip there recently, and that was the first question that people always asked. So before we talk about Congress, I wanted to share with you a little bit of some recent research I've been doing on Chinese propaganda coverage of the American presidential election. So, quick segue. So I've been tracking since May propaganda coverage in China's 5 major state-run newspapers of the election. And the question is, what are they saying about it? Surprisingly, you might find out it actually favors Hillary. So 2 graphs really quickly. So first of all, this is a figure of the volume of reporting on the 2 candidates since this summer. You can see here that at the beginning of the summer, there was roughly 5 times as much coverage of Trump than Clinton. That steadily narrowed in the Chinese propaganda apparatus. Today, they're almost equal coverage, simply in terms of volume. But more interestingly, perhaps, is the tone. So to look at editorial tone, I focused on references to the candidate in the main propaganda newspapers and saw in the words around that candidate's mention whether the words were positive or negative. And what you can see is that the propaganda line has been systematically in favor of Hillary as Secretary Clinton is typically mentioned in the newspapers there. So that's an interesting tidbit. I thought you might be interested to know. This is coming out in the Washington Post blog, The Monkey Cage, in a few days. But it's interesting to see how the propaganda has varied over time. So let's talk about Congress. It'll come as no surprise to the people in this room that Congress and the president have often been at odds on China policy. One of the main examples of this was after Tiananmen. So obviously, June 4th, there was a great deal of death in the square, and Congress got extremely animated about this, remains animated to this day. This is a figure of a congressional hearing. These are bringing together Tiananmen Square survivors to recount their stories. And this is something that happens annually on the anniversary of June 4th. And it is also something that has wrinkled relations between those 2 states. So President Bush, at the time, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, was in favor of quietly continuing U.S.-China relations and restoring trust between the 2 countries. This was not at all what Congress wanted to do. Congress was in favor of revoking China's most favored nation trading status. President Bush did not believe that was the way to improve Chinese human rights practices in the long run. Instead, he wanted to continue with most favored nation status and work with the Chinese over time. This is a picture of him. He had a long history in China, and he believed from his experience there that that was the right way to go forward. This was something that became a major issue of tension between Congress and the president. This is a document from some declassified documents from the Bush archive. One of his advisors told him that an ugly confrontation awaits us with Congress. A majority in both houses are eager to humiliate us on our China policy. So here, this is one of the most obvious instances in which Congress and the president have been at odds on China. It is not, however, the only instance. One of the other major moments of tension in the bilateral relationship happened in the mid-90s. So Congress was adamant about extending a visa to the president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui. The White House advised strongly against it. At the time, there was a standing protocol between the United States and China that the United States would not host in an official capacity any Taiwanese government officials. Nonetheless, despite White House protestations, Congress extended a visa to Lee Teng-hui, who came and gave a speech at his alma mater, Cornell, which mentioned a lot of political tensions on Taiwan, Taiwan's quest for democracy, etc. This became a major thorn in the relationship. China followed up with this event with a major military exercise in the Taiwan Strait. It was one of the instances in which the United States and China came closest to conflict and was in many ways a result of China's response to legislative executive tension in the United States. So, also, recently declassified documents are interesting here. So in the Oval Office, this is a recently declassified file. President Clinton said, "We bend over backwards to accommodate China's domestic politics. Why can't they do the same for us?" So the question is, how does legislative opposition affect America's China policy? So IR theory says actually legislative opposition should be beneficial to the conduct of democratic foreign relations. The reason IR scholars argue is that there is a good cop, bad cop dynamic at work. What that means is that a president can go abroad, can engage in international negotiations with China or some other state, and can say, listen, I have a tough domestic audience. I can't pass I can't strike a deal here that's very favorable to you, so give me more in this negotiation. Otherwise, I can't take this back to Congress and get them to sign it. So IR theory says that legislative opposition is actually very helpful for president bargaining abroad. However, there actually is very, very little data or empirical work on this. And the reason is that it's a really difficult question to answer empirically. The reason is something that political scientists call reverse causality. So the issue here is that it's obviously the case that when Congress passes legislation that's hostile to Chinese interests, like a bill commemorating Tiananmen, for example, China is going to respond aggressively in its foreign policy towards the United States. But it's also the case that whenever China does something that's perceived as aggressive, Congress is likely to respond with exactly the same sort of legislation. So this is an instance in which one thing causes the other, and there's mutual causation. So to answer this question empirically, what I did was to take a look at all the bills passed in Congress about China, and indeed about any topic. So this figure you can see here is it's a figure of the daily number of bills passed in Congress ever. So 1973 is when Congress started recording all of its legislation online. I used a technique for computer science called scraping, which is to write a computer programming script to get online and to download all those bills for you. So there are 365,000 of those, and you can see them in blue. And what's interesting is that you can see real patterns day to day in bill frequency. So you can look at the spikes here, and what you see is that Congress is far more active on certain days before congressional deadlines. So obviously, right after the State of the Union, all the lawmakers were in Washington, and what you see is they pass a lot of bills, often in response to the State of the Union. You also see, more interestingly, right before holiday weekends, right before members of Congress go home from Memorial Day weekend, before they go home from Independence Day weekend, and also before the August congressional recess, when they go to their home districts for a month. On those days, right before they leave DC, there's this rush to to pass all this legislation that's been waiting on the table for a while. The most important deadline is the fiscal year. So they have to push through the appropriations bills and get things and agencies funded in time for the next year. So this pattern, this bursty pattern of daily legislative activity is something that you can exploit with econometric techniques. So when you have a typical high-volume day, what that also means is that there's a source of exogenous variation in the amount of anti-China legislation. So you can see that in red. Of all these 365,000 bills, I also used computer science techniques to find out that 3,000 of them explicitly referenced China. So then I went and I read those 3,000 bills and coded whether or not they were hostile to Chinese interests. So this is a really nice thing in terms of identifying causality, because what it means is that when you have these high volume periods before these holiday weekends, where you see way more legislative activity than you typically do, what that means is you have an exogenous source of variation in anti-China bills. When there is one of these deadlines, you're going to see many more total bills, and also, as a result, many more anti-China bills. What that means is that we can actually estimate the effect of these anti-China bills upon China's foreign policy towards the United States, as long as we meet one condition, which is that these periods where you see high volume activity they're only allowed to affect China's foreign policy towards the United States through the channel of these anti-China bills, these increased number of anti-China bills. As long as that is the case, then we're able to identify an actual causal effect and not just a correlation. So that is the research design. Now, let's take a look at the descriptive evidence. So here, we return to our graph. We see in blue the average number of bills every day. And in red, this is a trend line that shows Chinese conflict initiation towards the United States. Now, the blue line was built with computer science techniques. The red line was a simple exercise in reading historical documents. So reading through U.S.-China diplomatic history, coding what each state did on each day. So that's just a count of the number of conflictual events that China initiates towards the United States. Now what you can see is that after those spikes in blue activity, so congressional hostility towards China, After that, what you see is that there tends to be more Chinese conflict on average. So days that, on average, since the 1970s, have seen more anti-China bills are typically followed with the red spikes, days where you see more Chinese conflict initiation towards the United States. So this is just simple descriptive data, but we can also dive into it a bit more deeply. So a difference in means will show you that on average, on a normal day, so a normal typical day in Congress, China is around, it'll initiate on average maybe one seriously cooperative event with the United States every 100 days. So there's a 1% chance on any given day of China engaging in an act of substantive, meaningful cooperation. However, after you have these periods where China passes hostile legislation, the effect is much different. So only 60%, China's only 60% is likely to engage in cooperation after Congress has done something hostile towards Chinese interest. Now, this is a very simple difference in means, but what you can see is if you actually put it in a real model where we control for all the other things that might affect Chinese foreign policy, the effect is even larger. So when you control for China's recent behavior, economic conditions, various things happening in international politics, what you find then is that when Congress engages in hostility, China is only 25% as likely to cooperate with the president as it would otherwise. So what does this really mean? This means that even though IR theory suggests that legislatures are helpful for the president because there can be a good cop, bad cop dynamic, this isn't always the case. And it really hasn't been the case in U.S.-China relations, as many of you probably believe anecdotally. So when you have legislative opposition to Chinese foreign policy, the president is able to win fewer policy concessions in international negotiations. Just like President Clinton said, he complained about China not understanding its domestic politics, and just as Bush complained about with Congress trying to humiliate his China policy. And also, this is something that is not likely to go away anytime soon. Here's a recent photo, this is from 2015, of Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan hosting the Dalai Lama. Obviously, the president meets with the Dalai Lama every once in a while. It obviously always creates crises in U.S.-China relations. Nonetheless, Congress is much more active on the Tibet front than the president is, often does so at very inconvenient times for the president. So this tension between legislative executive preferences over China policy is not likely to go away anytime soon, and in meaningful and substantive ways affects and decreases America's ability to win policy concessions from China when it occurs. Thank you.